Some folks say a man can lose everything and still find his way back. But Eli Thorne had buried that hope, along with his wife 20 winters ago. After decades of drifting through broken towns and empty bottles, he inherited his dead brothers, rotted cabin in Bitter Hollow, and a limping old dog named Boone. Eli figured he'd chop wood and wait to die. That half-blind retriever had different plans. One morning, Boone started digging behind the shed, like his life depended on it. What he found wasn't bones or trash. It was a rusted box containing $3 million in old bonds and gold certificates from an unsolved robbery. Now, dangerous men with long memories are coming for what they think is theirs. The question is, will this unexpected fortune give a broken man reason to live again or destroy what little peace he has left? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, crumpled and stained with what looked like coffee rings. Eli Thorne held it between calloused fingers, reading the lawyer's words for the third time, while his coffee grew cold in the diner booth. His brother, Marcus, was dead, and somehow that felt like losing someone he'd already buried years ago. The inheritance consisted of a cabin in Bitter Hollow, wherever the hell that was, and one dog, elderly, answering to the name Boone. The lawyer's note mentioned the property sat 47 miles northeast of Millfield, accessible only by logging road, and came with 17 acres of pine forest that hadn't seen a chainsaw in decades. Eli twisted the thin gold band on his ring finger, a habit that had persisted through 20 years of widowhood. Sarah would have known what to do about Marcus, about the cabin, about the dog. She'd always been the one who could make sense of family complications, who could bridge the gap between two stubborn brothers who couldn't seem to occupy the same room without tension thick enough to cut. But Sarah was buried in Riverside Cemetery, and Eli was sitting alone in a truck-stop diner, staring at his last connection to family he'd tried to forget. The drive to Bitter Hollow took him through country that grew wilder with each passing mile. Paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt tracks that wound between towering pines and granite outcroppings. The deeper he drove into the mountains, the more the world seemed to close in around him. Cell phone towers disappeared behind ridgelines. Road signs became scarce, then vanished altogether. When he finally found the turnoff marked only by a weathered post with Thorne carved into sun-bleached wood, Eli felt something shift in his chest. This was real. Marcus had been real, had lived in this place, had died here alone. The cabin sat in a clearing that might have been beautiful once. Now it looked like something from a fairy tale gone wrong. Windows bordered with mismatched planks, a roof that sagged under the weight of fallen branches, and a porch that had surrendered to gravity on one side. Weeds grew tall around the foundation, and what had once been a garden was now a tangle of wild growth reclaiming its territory. Eli parked his truck beside a cord of split wood that looked fresh, despite being covered in pine needles. Someone had been working here recently. Marcus, he supposed, though his brother had never been much for physical labor when they were young. The front door stood ajar, hanging from hinges that protested with rusty squeaks when Eli pushed it open. The smell hit him first. Pine sap and old coffee, leather and something medicinal he couldn't identify. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that stabbed through gaps in the boarded windows, and every footstep echoed in the emptiness. The cabin was larger inside than it appeared from the road. One main room served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating the far wall. A narrow staircase led to what must be a sleeping loft. Furniture sat under canvas dropcloths like sleeping ghosts, and books lined shelves built into every available wall space. It was the books that made Eli pause. Marcus had been a reader in childhood, always disappearing with some adventure story, while Eli practiced with his father's rifles or helped with farm chores. But these weren't adventure stories. These were serious volumes: history, philosophy, natural science, books that suggested a mind searching for answers to questions Eli couldn't imagine. On the mantel above the fireplace, he found a photograph in a simple wooden frame. Marcus, looking older than Eli remembered, standing beside a large golden retriever. In front of this same cabin, both man and dog were smiling, if dogs could smile, and Marcus had his hand resting on the animal's head with obvious affection. "Boone," Eli said to the empty room, and as if summoned by his name, a low whine came from somewhere behind the cabin. He found the dog lying in the shade of an old apple tree, watching him with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold reservations. About this new human. Boone was old, that much was obvious. His golden coat had gone white around the muzzle, and when he stood to greet Eli, his hindquarters moved with the careful deliberation of arthritic joints. But there was something else. In those eyes, something that reminded Eli of soldiers he'd known, men who had seen too much and carried it quietly, without complaint. The dog approached slowly, sniffed his offered hand, then sat back on his haunches and studied Eli with what could only be described as judgment. "So you're my inheritance too, are you?" Eli asked, and Boone's tail thumped once against the ground, as if acknowledging the complexity of their situation. The dog was thin, too thin, and Eli realized Marcus must have been sick for some time before the end. In the cabin's kitchen he found bags of dog food and medicine bottles with Boone's name on veterinary labels. Heart medication, arthritis pills, something for seizures. Marcus had been taking care of this animal with the dedication of a man who had little else to care for. That first night, Eli slept on Marcus's couch with Boone lying nearby, close enough to touch, but maintaining a careful distance. The dog didn't fully trust him yet, but seemed willing to accept his presence as long as he didn't make any sudden moves or demands. As darkness settled over Bitter Hollow, bringing with it sounds Eli hadn't heard in decades, owl calls and the rustle of small creatures moving through undergrowth, he found himself thinking about the paths that had led both brothers to this place. Marcus, isolated and scholarly, caring for an aging dog in a cabin surrounded by wilderness. Himself, drifting through years of odd jobs and temporary apartments, carrying his grief like a stone in his chest. In the morning, he would need to decide what to do with this inheritance. The practical choice would be to sell everything, find a home for the dog, and continue his aimless journey toward whatever end awaited him. But lying there in the darkness, listening to Boone's steady breathing and the wind in the pines, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of being exactly where he was supposed to be, against the far wall, partially hidden. Behind a bookshelf, he noticed something that made him sit up. A walking stick, carved from what looked like mountain ash, leaned against the logs. The handle was worn smooth from use, and intricate designs ran the length of the shaft, birds and leaves and symbols that seemed to tell a story Eli couldn't read. It was beautiful work, the kind of careful craftsmanship that took patience and skill. Marcus had always been good with his hands, but this suggested years of practice, of long evenings spent shaping wood while Boone lay at his feet and the fire crackled in the grate. Eli reached for the stick, then stopped. Some things, he realized, were meant to be approached slowly, with respect for the man who had made them and the solitude they represented. Marcus had carved this walking stick in a place where no one would see it or admire his skill. He had made it for the simple pleasure of creation, for the meditation of working with his hands while his mind wrestled with whatever demons had driven him to this remote hollow. Tomorrow, Eli would explore more of the cabin and its surroundings. He would learn about his brother's life in this place and figure out what to do with the responsibility that had fallen to him. But tonight, he was content to lie still and listen to the sound of Boone's breathing, feeling less alone than he had in longer than he could remember. 3 days into his stay at the cabin, Eli had settled into a routine that felt surprisingly comfortable. He rose with the sun, made coffee on Marcus's wood-burning stove, and spent his mornings exploring the property while Boone limped along at his own pace. The dog had warmed to him gradually, accepting food from his hand and even allowing the occasional scratch behind the ears. It was on the fourth morning that Boone's behavior changed. Eli was splitting kindling behind the cabin when he noticed the dog standing rigid near the old shed, his head cocked at an angle that suggested intense concentration. The retriever's whole body quivered with suppressed energy, and a low whine escaped his throat, not the casual sound of a dog wanting attention, but something urgent and focused. "What is it, boy?" Eli asked, setting down his axe and wiping sweat. From his forehead, Boone didn't acknowledge him. Instead, the dog began to pace back and forth along a section of ground behind the shed, his nose pressed close to the earth. His movements were deliberate, methodical, like a bloodhound working a scent trail. But this wasn't the casual investigation of interesting smells that Eli had observed over the past few days. This was something else entirely. The dog began to dig. At first, Eli assumed Boone had caught the scent of some small animal, a mole or ground squirrel, that had made the mistake of burrowing too close to the surface. Dogs dug holes. It was what they did. But as he watched, something about the retriever's intensity made him uneasy. Boone dug with the focused desperation of an animal possessed. Dirt flew from his claws in steady streams, and he paused only to thrust his muzzle deeper into the growing hole, sniffing and whining before returning to his excavation. His arthritic joints seemed forgotten in the urgency of whatever drove him. "Easy there, old fellow," Eli said, approaching cautiously. "What's got you so worked up?" But when he knelt beside the hole and looked down, his words died in his throat. About 18 inches down, partially exposed by Boone's digging, something metallic caught the morning light. Not the dull gleam of a buried tin can or discarded tool, but the deliberate shine of manufactured metal, tarnished but unmistakably purposeful. Eli's pulse quickened. He gently moved Boone aside and began digging with his hands, brushing away loose soil with the care of an archaeologist uncovering something precious. The object was larger than he'd expected, and heavier. As more of its surface became visible, he realized he was looking at a strong box. Old, rusted at the corners, but intact. The box measured roughly 12 inches square and perhaps 8 inches deep. A heavy-duty padlock secured the lid, green with age but still solid. Numbers were etched into the metal near the lock, not a combination, but what looked like a serial number or inventory mark. Boone sat back on his haunches, panting heavily from his exertion, and watched Eli with those intelligent eyes. The dog's tail wagged slowly, as if he was pleased to have finally communicated something important. "How did you know?" Eli asked quietly, running his fingers along the box's corroded surface. "How did you know this was here?" The strong box felt substantial in his hands, dense with whatever it contained. He carried it into the cabin and set it on Marcus's kitchen table, studying it in the better light. The metal was steel, painted black originally, but now mottled with rust and wear. The lock was substantial, not the kind of cheap hardware store variety that could be cut with bolt cutters, but serious security. In Marcus's tool shed, Eli found what he needed. His brother had kept a well-organized workshop with hand tools, hanging from pegboard hooks, and larger equipment stored on sturdy shelves. A heavy-duty grinder with a cutting wheel made quick work of the old padlock, though Eli found himself strangely reluctant to destroy it. Something about the finality of cutting through that last barrier made him pause, but curiosity won, as it always did. The lock fell away with a metallic clang, and Eli lifted the lid, his breath caught in his chest. The box was filled with currency. Not loose bills, but neat stacks of hundreds bound with rubber bands, many of which had deteriorated with age. Beneath the cash, he found what looked like official documents, certificates of some kind, yellowed with time but bearing official seals and signatures. With trembling hands, he lifted out one of the certificates. Bearer bonds, he realized after. Studying the formal language and elaborate printing, negotiable securities worth substantial sums, and beneath those, gold certificates, Actual treasury documents that had once been redeemable for precious metal, the cash alone represented more money than Eli had seen in his lifetime. But the bonds and certificates suggested wealth on an entirely different scale. His hands shook as he counted, recounted, then gave up trying to calculate the exact total. Hundreds of thousands, certainly, possibly millions. But it was the newspaper clipping folded at the bottom of the box that made his blood run cold. The headline was from the Millfield Chronicle, dated September 15th, 1998. Armored car robbery leaves 2 dead, 3.2 million missing. Below that, a smaller subhead, federal investigation ongoing, suspects remain at large. Eli sank into one of Marcus's kitchen chairs, the clipping in his hands. The article described a brazen daylight robbery of an armored car making deposits at First National Bank of Millfield. 2 guards had been killed. The perpetrators had escaped with the vehicle and its contents, abandoning it later in the mountains. Despite an extensive federal investigation, neither the money nor the criminals had ever been found. The date on the newspaper was 25 years old. The money in the strongbox matched the stolen amount exactly. His brother Marcus had been involved in a robbery that left 2 men dead. Eli's mind reeled as he tried to process this information. Marcus, who had read philosophy books and carved walking sticks, who had cared for an aging dog with gentle devotion, that same Marcus had somehow been connected to armed robbery and murder. But even as the shock settled over him, questions began forming. If Marcus had participated in the heist, why hadn't he spent the money? Why live like a hermit in a remote cabin, splitting his own firewood and growing vegetables, while millions of dollars sat buried behind his shed? And how had Boone known exactly where to dig? The dog sat near the kitchen door, watching Eli with what could only be described as expectant patience, as if waiting for him to understand something important. Those brown eyes held intelligence, yes, but also something else, a kind of knowing sadness that suggested this moment had been inevitable. Eli looked again at the newspaper clipping, studying the accompanying photograph of the crime scene. 2 families had lost fathers that day. Federal agents had spent years trying to solve the case, and all this time the evidence had been buried in a Montana hollow, watched over by a dog who somehow understood its significance. Outside, the wind picked up, sending pine needles scratching against the cabin's windows. The sound seemed ominous now, like fingers tapping against glass, seeking entrance to secrets that had remained hidden for a quarter century. As Eli sat there surrounded by stolen money and unanswered questions, he realized that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. The simple inheritance of a cabin and a dog had transformed into something that could destroy him, or force him to confront truths about his brother that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Boone rose from his position by the door and walked slowly to Eli's chair, resting his graying head against the man's knee. The gesture felt like comfort, but also like a warning. They were in this together now, the old dog seemed to be saying. Whatever came next, they would face it as Marcus would have wanted. Together. In the distance, barely audible above the wind, Eli thought he heard the sound of a vehicle engine echoing through the mountains. The engine sound Eli had heard faded into the distance, leaving only the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the steady tick of Marcus's old mantel clock. But the moment had shattered his sense of isolation, replacing it with a creeping awareness that Bitter Hollow might not be as remote as it seemed. He spent the next hour searching the cabin more thoroughly, looking for anything that might explain his brother's connection to the robbery. In Marcus's bedroom upstairs, he found more books, military history, survival manuals, texts on criminal psychology. A pattern was emerging, though Eli couldn't yet make sense of it. Behind a loose board in the bedroom wall, his fingers found something unexpected, a manila folder thick with documents. Inside, he discovered what could only be described as an obsessive collection of information about the Millfield robbery, newspaper clippings from a dozen different papers, printed articles from internet sources, even what appeared to be copies of police reports. But these weren't the materials of someone celebrating a successful heist. They read more like the research of a man tormented by guilt, seeking to understand every consequence of his actions. Marcus had tracked the investigation's progress, documented the lives of the murdered guards, even compiled information about their families. One clipping made Eli's stomach turn. An obituary for Daniel Reeves, aged 34, survived by wife Jennifer and 2 young daughters. The photo showed a man in uniform, smiling beside his family. Another article detailed Robert Chen's funeral, describing how his parents had immigrated from Taiwan to give their son better opportunities, only to lose him to senseless violence. These men had died for money that Marcus had never spent, never enjoyed, never used to improve his life in any measurable way. The weight of that realization settled on Eli like a physical burden. A low rumble from outside interrupted his thoughts. This time, there was no mistaking the sound. A vehicle was approaching the cabin, moving slowly along the rough logging road. Eli quickly returned the folder to its hiding place and moved to a front window, peering through a gap in the boards. A sheriff's department SUV rounded the last bend, its light bar catching the afternoon sun. The vehicle stopped near Eli's truck, and a woman in uniform emerged, adjusting her hat as she surveyed the property. She was perhaps 40, with graying brown hair pulled back severely and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Boone had risen to his feet, his hackles slightly raised, but his tail wagging uncertainly. The dog seemed to recognize the newcomer, but wasn't sure whether her presence was welcome or threatening. Eli met the sheriff at the front door, trying to project calm normalcy despite the strongbox full of stolen money sitting on his kitchen table. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked, extending a hand. "I'm Sheriff Kate Morrison. I heard you'd come up to settle Marcus's affairs." Her handshake was firm, her eyes direct and assessing. This was a woman who missed very little, Eli realized. He would need to be careful. "That's right," he replied, "just trying to figure out what to do with the place." "Marcus was a good neighbor," she said, though her tone carried subtle reservations. "Quiet, kept to himself mostly. We'll miss having him around." She knelt to greet Boone, who accepted her attention with obvious familiarity. "Hey there, old boy. You doing okay with your new person?" The easy way she interacted with the dog suggested she'd been here before, probably more than once. How well had she known Marcus, and what might he have told her about his past? "I was actually hoping to ask you a few questions about your brother," Morrison continued, straightening up. "Nothing urgent, just some loose ends I'm trying to tie up." Eli's pulse quickened, but he nodded calmly. "Of course. Would you like some coffee?" Inside the cabin, Morrison's eyes took in everything with professional thoroughness. She noted the books, the covered furniture, the general state of careful maintenance that suggested Marcus had been a meticulous man. Her gaze lingered on the kitchen table where the strongbox had been, though Eli had moved it to his bedroom closet after examining its contents. "Marcus called the department a few times over the past year," she said, accepting a mug of coffee. "Said he'd been seeing strangers around the property, people who didn't belong. Claimed they were asking questions in town about him." The coffee cup felt slippery in Eli's hands. "What kind of questions?" "Oh, the usual things people ask when they're trying to find someone who doesn't want to be found. How long had he lived here? Did he have family? That sort of thing." Morrison's eyes met his directly. Marcus seemed to think these folks might have ulterior motives. Eli chose his words carefully. "Did you ever see anyone suspicious yourself?" "A few times. City types, driving expensive cars that weren't made for mountain roads. They'd come through a town, ask their questions, then disappear for months, but they always came back eventually." She paused, sipping her coffee while studying Eli's reaction. "Marcus never told me why these people might be looking for him, but he was genuinely frightened. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure Boone was taken care of. The implication hung in the air between them. Morrison suspected there was more to Marcus's story than a simple hermit's paranoia, and she was wondering how much Eli knew about his brother's secrets. I wish I could help, Eli said truthfully. Marcus and I weren't close. I hadn't seen him in over 15 years before he died. Family quarrel. Something like that. Eli wasn't ready to discuss the complex resentments that had driven the brothers apart, especially not with a law enforcement officer who might already suspect Marcus of criminal activity. Morrison finished her coffee and stood to leave, but her departure felt more like a tactical retreat than a conclusion. If you remember anything that might explain why people were looking for Marcus, I hope you'll let me know. Those strangers haven't been around since the funeral, but that doesn't mean they won't be back. After she left, Eli found himself pacing the cabin like a caged animal. Morrison's visit confirmed his worst fears. Other people knew about the robbery, and they'd been searching for Marcus for years. His brother's death might have provided temporary relief, but now they would undoubtedly turn their attention to the inheritance. He retrieved the strongbox from the closet and stared at its contents again, as if the money might offer some explanation for the choices that had led to this moment. But the bills and bonds remained silent, holding their secrets as tightly as Marcus had held his. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the clearing, Boone's behavior became agitated again. The dog paced from window to window occasionally, stopping to stare into the darkening forest with the intensity he'd shown while digging behind the shed. His low whines carried a note of warning that made Eli's skin crawl. When full darkness fell, Eli turned off all the lights and sat in Marcus's chair by the front window, watching the forest for any sign of movement. Boone lay at his feet, alert and tense, occasionally lifting his head to listen to sounds Eli couldn't hear. Around midnight he saw them, brief flashes of light moving through the trees, too deliberate to be natural phenomena. Flashlights, he realized, carried by people who were trying to approach the cabin without being seen. Eli's hand moved instinctively to his hip, seeking a weapon that wasn't there. He'd been out of the military for decades, but some instincts never fully disappeared. Right now, those instincts were screaming danger. The lights in the forest disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving Eli staring into impenetrable darkness while his heart hammered against his ribs. Beside him, Boone remained rigid. With attention, his ears pricked forward and his breathing shallow. They waited through the long hours until dawn, but no one approached the cabin. When morning light finally filtered through the boarded windows, Eli found himself exhausted and jumpy, starting at every creak of settling wood and rustle of wind-blown leaves. He needed answers, and he suspected Marcus had left more clues than just the newspaper clippings. After feeding Boone and forcing himself to eat something, Eli began a systematic search of the cabin, looking for anything his brother might have hidden. In a wooden crate beneath the kitchen sink, he found what he was looking for, a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Marcus's careful handwriting. The entries began 3 years ago and continued almost until his death, chronicling a man's struggle with conscience and fear in equal measure. The first entry made Eli's blood run cold. They found me again today, 3 of them this time asking old Peterson at the general store if he knew where the Thorn place was. Peterson's too smart to give strangers directions to isolated cabins, but they'll figure it out eventually. They always do. I never should have taken Vince's deal. 25 years, and I still wake up seeing Danny Reeves's face when that gun went off. But Carver made it sound so simple. Inside information, clean getaway, nobody gets hurt. He lied about everything else, so why did I believe that part? Boone knows something's wrong. Dogs always know. Eli flipped through more pages, piecing together a story that made his stomach churn. Marcus hadn't been a willing participant in the robbery. He'd been coerced into providing inside information about the armored car routes by Vince Carver, a man with connections to organized crime who had discovered Marcus's gambling debts and threatened to hurt their elderly parents if he didn't cooperate. But the robbery had gone wrong from the start. What was supposed to be a simple theft had turned violent when one of the guards drew his weapon. In the chaos that followed, both guards died, and Marcus had watched it happen from the getaway car, trapped by circumstances he'd never intended to create. The journal revealed that Marcus had taken his share of the money not out of greed, but out of fear. Carver had insisted that keeping quiet was worth more than talking to the FBI. But instead of spending it, Marcus had hidden the money and disappeared into the mountains, hoping distance and time would let him escape the consequences of that terrible day. Another entry, dated just 6 months ago, detailed a close call. Carver's people were at the cabin last night. I saw their lights through the trees, heard them talking outside. They think I'm holding out on them, that I know where the rest of the money is hidden. They don't understand that this was always about fear, not greed. If they find the strongbox, they'll kill me for sure. Not because of the money, that's meaningless to them now. They'll kill me because I know their names, their faces, their methods. I'm the only witness left who can connect them to Danny Reeves and Robert Chen. I need to make arrangements for Boone. If something happens to me, he shouldn't suffer for my mistakes. The final entries were increasingly paranoid and fragmented, describing shadowy figures watching from the forest and unfamiliar vehicles on the logging roads. Marcus had known his time was running out, but he'd also been planning for this possibility. In a sealed envelope tucked between the journal's back pages, Eli found a letter addressed to him. Brother, if you're reading this, then Boone has shown you where I hid the money, and you know what I did 25 years ago. I won't insult you by asking for forgiveness. Some sins are too heavy for that. But I need you to understand that I never intended for anyone to die. Vincent Carver is still out there, still looking for me. He believes I know the location of the money the other crew members hid, but I was never part of their inner circle. They used me and discarded me, just like Carver used us all. The money in the strongbox belongs to the families of the men who died. I should have returned it years ago, but I was too much of a coward to face what I'd done. Maybe you'll have more courage than your brother ever did. Take care of Boone. He's been the only family I deserved. Marcus. Eli sat in the kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of his brother's torment, trying to process the magnitude of what he'd inherited. Not just money and property, but a legacy of violence and guilt that stretched back decades. A sound from outside made him look up sharply. Boone had moved to the front door and was growling low in his throat, his hackles raised. Through the gaps, in the boarded windows, Eli could see a black SUV parked beside his truck. 3 men stood near the vehicles, and even at a distance, Eli could see they weren't local law enforcement. They wore expensive suits despite the mountain setting, and their movements had the calculated precision of people accustomed to violence. The largest of the 3 began walking toward the cabin, while the others flanked the building, moving with coordinated efficiency that suggested military or paramilitary training. These weren't desperate criminals or small-time thugs. They were professionals. Eli quickly hid the journal and letter, then checked to make sure the strongbox was secure in the bedroom closet. His mind raced through options, all of them bad. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in an isolated location with no means of escape. The knock on the front door, when it came, was polite and measured. "Mr. Thorne, we'd like to speak with you about your brother." The voice was cultured, almost friendly, but it carried an undertone of threat that made Boone's growling intensify. Eli placed a calming hand on the dog's head and approached the door cautiously. "I'm listening," he called out. "It would be better if we could discuss this face to face. We're not here to cause trouble. We just want to recover some property that belonged to our employer." Eli's military training kicked in, analyzing the tactical situation with cold precision. 3 hostiles, unknown weapons, elevated positions, commanding the exits, his own resources. an aging dog, a cabin with limited sightlines, and whatever improvised weapons he could find. "What kind of property?" he asked, stalling for time while his mind worked through possibilities. "Items that your brother was keeping safe for us. We believe you may have found them by now." The politeness was wearing thin, Eli noticed. These men weren't accustomed to negotiation or patience. They were used to taking what they wanted through intimidation or force. Beside him, Boone suddenly stood and moved toward the back of the cabin, his body language shifting from defensive to alert. The dog had heard something Eli missed. Movement in the forest behind the building, perhaps, or the approach of additional vehicles. Sheriff Morrison's words echoed in his memory. "Those strangers haven't been around since the funeral, but that doesn't mean they won't be back." They were back, and this time they weren't just asking questions. Eli's eyes swept the cabin, cataloging everything that might serve as a weapon or tactical advantage. Marcus's wood-splitting axe leaned against the fireplace. A heavy iron poker hung beside it. In the kitchen drawers, he knew there were sharp knives, though bringing a blade to what was likely a gunfight seemed optimistic at best. But it was the folded papers he'd glimpsed earlier, tucked behind Marcus's collection of survival manuals, that suddenly took on new significance. His brother had been preparing for this possibility. "Mr. Thorne," the voice outside carried a sharper edge now. "We're going to need you to step outside so we can have a proper conversation." "Give me a minute," Eli called back, moving swiftly, but quietly to the bookshelf. Behind a thick volume on wilderness survival, his fingers found what Marcus had hidden, hand-drawn maps of the property and surrounding forest, marked with symbols and notations that looked like escape routes and defensive positions. Marcus had been thinking like a soldier, not just a frightened hermit. The maps showed hidden paths through the forest, natural choke points where pursuers could be slowed or stopped, and what appeared to be supply caches marked with small X's at strategic locations. One map focused specifically on the cabin itself, detailing sightlines, fields of fire, and structural weak points. Marcus had noted which windows offered the best defensive positions and which walls could stop small arms fire. More importantly, he'd marked a concealed exit through the root cellar that Eli hadn't even known existed. Boone's low growling intensified, and the dog moved to the back door, his nose pressed against the gap beneath it. Someone was definitely approaching from behind the cabin. The polite negotiation outside was just a distraction while other team members got into position. Eli grabbed the maps and stuffed them into his jacket pocket, then quickly retrieved the strongbox from the bedroom closet. If he was going to run, he couldn't leave the evidence of Marcus's crime behind. But the box was heavy and awkward to carry, and speed might mean the difference between escape and capture. A new voice joined the conversation outside, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Eli caught fragments. "Around back," and "no other." "A way out." Their patience was ending. Moving as quietly as possible, Eli found the concealed entrance to the root cellar behind a heavy wooden cabinet in the kitchen. The cabinet slid aside more easily than its appearance suggested, revealing a narrow opening that dropped down into darkness. Marcus had built this escape route with care, ensuring it looked like nothing more than unused storage space to casual observation. The cellar was deeper than Eli expected, with rough stone walls and a packed earth floor. But more importantly, it extended beyond the cabin's foundation, ending at what appeared to be a natural cave opening that led into the hillside behind the building. As he lowered the strongbox into the cellar, Eli heard the unmistakable sound of the front door splintering. They'd given up on polite requests. "Search everything," commanded the cultured voice, now inside the cabin. "He's here somewhere, and so is our property." Boone had followed Eli into the cellar, moving with surprising agility for his age and condition. The dog seemed to understand they were in serious danger, and that silence was crucial for survival. Together, they crawled through the cave opening and into a narrow tunnel that angled upward through the hillside. The tunnel was partially natural, following a limestone seam in the rock, but Marcus had clearly expanded and reinforced it over the years. Wooden braces supported the ceiling in places where the stone was unstable, and the floor had been leveled and cleared of debris. After perhaps 50 yards of careful crawling, the tunnel emerged into a small clearing hidden among dense pines about 100 yards behind the cabin. From this position, Eli could see the building and the black SUV, as well as 2 additional vehicles that had arrived while he was underground. Another SUV and a panel van that suggested this was a larger operation than he'd initially realized. Men moved around the cabin with military precision, establishing a perimeter while others searched inside. Eli counted at least 6, possibly more, all of them armed and coordinated. These weren't street criminals looking for easy money. They were professional operators with substantial resources and training. His phone showed no signal bars, which wasn't surprising given the mountain location, but it meant he couldn't call for help, even if he'd been inclined to trust local law enforcement with knowledge of the stolen money. Boone pressed against his leg, offering comfort and warmth in the cold mountain air. The dog's breathing was labored from the tunnel crawl, but his eyes remained alert and focused. Whatever medication Marcus had been giving him was keeping the worst of his health problems at bay, at least for now. According to Marcus's map, there were supply caches scattered throughout the forest, marked with cryptic symbols that suggested food, water, and possibly weapons. His brother had been preparing for a siege, planning to disappear into the wilderness if Carver's people finally found him. But Eli wasn't Marcus. He didn't know these mountains the way his brother had, and he was responsible for an aging, sick dog who wouldn't survive a prolonged chase through rough terrain. Running might keep them alive temporarily, but it wasn't a long-term solution. The sound of shouting from the cabin indicated the search was becoming more intense. They'd discovered the hidden root cellar entrance, which meant the tunnel would be compromised soon. Eli needed to move, but first he had to make a choice that would define everything that followed. He could disappear into the forest with the money, abandoning the cabin and everything Marcus had built there. The cash and bonds would buy him a new identity and a comfortable life far from Vincent Carver's reach. It would mean sacrificing any chance of justice for the murdered guards, but it would keep him and Boone alive. Or he could stay and fight. The rational choice was obvious. Run, hide, live to see another day. But as Eli looked down at Boone, he remembered the newspaper photos of the dead guards' families, the obituaries Marcus had kept like shrine offerings to his guilt. 2 good men had died for this money, and their families deserved better than watching it disappear into another criminal's hands. More than that, running would mean accepting the same burden of guilt that had destroyed Marcus, living the rest of his life, looking over his shoulder and waiting for the past to catch up. Eli had spent 20 years drifting aimlessly after Sarah's death, but maybe this was his chance to stand for something that mattered. The decision crystallized with sudden clarity. He wouldn't run, but he also wouldn't face 6 armed professionals in open combat with nothing but Marcus's axes and kitchen knives. According to the map, there was a supply cache about a quarter-mile deeper into the forest, marked with symbols that suggested it contained more than just food and water. Marcus had been a careful planner, and if he'd been preparing for a fight, he would have prepared properly. With Boone limping steadily beside him, Eli began making his way through the trees, moving toward whatever weapons or supplies his brother had hidden in the Montana wilderness. Behind them, the sounds of searching grew more frustrated and angry, echoing through the forest like the baying of hunting dogs. The supply cache was buried beneath a cairn of stones that looked natural to casual observation, but followed a specific pattern Marcus had noted on his map. 3 large granite boulders formed a triangle, with smaller rocks filling the spaces between them. Eli carefully dismantled the marker, revealing a waterproof container the size of a large toolbox. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, he found what Marcus had prepared for this moment: a military surplus rifle, a Remington 700 in .308 caliber that looked like it had seen service overseas. Beside it, 3 boxes of ammunition, a tactical scope already mounted and zeroed, and what appeared to be a ghillie suit, the camouflage garment snipers used to blend into natural environments. But it was the small wooden box at the bottom of the cache that made Eli's hands tremble. Inside, nested in foam padding, were military decorations, medals he recognized from his own service, plus some he didn't. A silver star, 2 bronze stars with V device for valor, a purple heart with 3 oak leaf clusters. Marcus had been a decorated combat veteran, something he'd never mentioned in the years before their estrangement. The citations, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves, told a story of exceptional courage under fire during multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Marcus Thorne, Army Rangers, had distinguished himself in ways that earned the respect and admiration of his commanders and fellow soldiers. The man who had participated in the Millfield robbery hadn't been a career criminal or a coward. He'd been a hero undone by circumstances and bad choices, carrying guilt that had eventually driven him into isolation. Eli understood that burden. His own military service had ended with memories he tried not to examine too closely. Night raids and split-second decisions that had kept his team alive, but haunted his dreams for years afterward. The difference was that Marcus had carried his ghosts alone, while Eli had at least had Sarah to help him process the darkness. A distant shout echoed through the forest, reminding him that grief and understanding were luxuries he couldn't afford. Right now, Carver's people had found the tunnel entrance and were probably spreading out through the woods, looking for his trail. The rifle felt familiar in his hands, despite the years since he'd last fired one in anger. Muscle memory took over. As he checked the action, confirmed the scope's 0 markers, and loaded a round into the chamber. The weapon was well maintained and properly sighted. Marcus had taken care of his equipment the way all good soldiers did. But Eli also found evidence of his brother's deteriorating mental state in the months before his death. A notebook contained increasingly paranoid observations about his pursuers, detailed profiles of Carver's known associates, and contingency plans that grew more desperate with each entry. One page made Eli's blood run cold. Carver sent his nephew Tommy to scout the property last week. Kid can't be more than 25. Probably thinks this is all a game. He doesn't understand what his uncle is capable of, what lengths Carver will go to protect his secrets. The old man's convinced I know where the other crew members hid their shares, but the truth is they never trusted me enough to include me in those plans. If Carver comes himself, I won't survive the encounter. He's not interested in money anymore. He's interested in eliminating loose ends. I'm the only person left who can connect him to the murders, and that makes me a liability he can't afford. Boone deserves better than this. If something happens to me, I hope whoever finds him will understand that he's more than just a dog. He's been my anchor to sanity, my reminder that there's still good in the world worth protecting. The notebook's final entry was dated just 2 weeks before Marcus's death. They're coming tomorrow. I can feel it in the way Boone's been acting, the same way he got before the ambush outside Kandahar when he saved my squad by detecting the IED placement. Dogs know when death is approaching. I've made my peace with God and with my mistakes. The money belongs to the families of the men who died, and if I don't survive to return it, maybe my brother will have the courage I never found. Eli always was the better man. Boone whined softly and pressed against Eli's leg, drawing his attention back to immediate dangers. The dog's ears were pricked forward, focused on sounds Eli couldn't yet hear, but that clearly indicated approaching threats. Moving carefully through the forest, Eli found a defensive position on high ground that offered good sight lines while providing cover behind a fallen log. The ghillie suit helped break up his outline among the shadows and undergrowth, and the rifle's scope brought distant targets into sharp focus. Through the trees, he could see at least 4 men moving through the forest in a coordinated search. A pattern. They were good, maintaining proper spacing, communicating through hand signals, checking potential ambush sites before advancing. But they were also operating in unfamiliar terrain, while Eli had the advantages of elevation, concealment, and Marcus's detailed knowledge of the local geography. The lead searcher was a young man who matched Marcus's description of Tommy Carver. Cocky and eager, moving with the confidence of someone who'd never faced serious opposition. Behind him came 2 older operators, veterans who understood the risks of moving through hostile territory, but were constrained by their need to find specific targets rather than simply survive. Eli's finger found the rifle's safety, disengaging it with practiced smoothness. The weapon was zeroed for 200 yards, and the nearest target was well within that range. One shot would announce his position to the other searchers, but it would also demonstrate that this wasn't going to be the easy recovery operation they'd expected. But as he settled the crosshairs on Tommy Carver's chest, doubt crept into his mind. This wasn't a battlefield overseas where the rules of engagement were clear and the enemy was defined by uniform and territory. This was a domestic situation involving American citizens, regardless of their criminal activities. More importantly, killing Carver's nephew would eliminate any possibility of negotiation or peaceful resolution. Once blood was spilled, this would become a war of mutual extermination that could only end with all parties dead or in federal prison. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance complicated the situation further. Either Carver had more resources than Marcus had realized, or law enforcement was finally responding to reports of suspicious activity in Bitter Hollow. Through the rifle scope, Eli watched Tommy Carver signal to his companions and change direction, moving toward the sound of the approaching aircraft. Their body language suggested confusion and concern rather than coordination. The helicopter wasn't part of their plan. Boone's condition was deteriorating under the stress of their flight through the forest. The old dog's breathing was labored, and his movements were becoming increasingly unsteady. Whatever medications Marcus had been giving him were wearing off, and the physical demands of their escape were taking a toll on his aging body. Eli faced an impossible choice: continue running and risk Boone's death from exhaustion and stress, or make a stand here with limited ammunition against superior numbers, knowing that surrender would likely mean death for both of them. The helicopter circled overhead, its downdraft sending pine needles and debris swirling through the forest. Canopy! Through his rifle scope, Eli watched Tommy Carver and his men take defensive positions, clearly as surprised by the aircraft's arrival as he was. But what he saw next through the scope made him lower his weapon in confusion. Sheriff Morrison emerged from the tree line below, her service weapon drawn but pointed downward in a non-threatening posture. She was speaking into a radio, coordinating with someone, and her movement suggested she was in command of the situation rather than responding to it. Vincent Carver, her voice carried clearly through the forest, amplified by a bullhorn. This is Sheriff Kate Morrison. You and your men need to drop your weapons and surrender immediately. The area is surrounded. Eli's mind reeled. Morrison had known about Carver, had been expecting this confrontation. But how? And why hadn't she warned him when she'd visited the cabin? Tommy Carver's response was immediate and violent. Gunfire erupted from the forest below as Carver's men opened fire on Morrison's position. The sheriff dove for cover behind a massive pine trunk, returning fire with practiced precision. But it was what happened next that shattered everything Eli thought he understood about the situation. Boone, despite his age and infirmity, suddenly bolted from Eli's side and began racing down the hillside toward the gunfight. The dog moved with purpose and urgency that seemed impossible given his physical condition, as if some deep instinct had overridden his body's limitations. "Boone!" Eli shouted, abandoning his concealed position to chase after the dog. What he saw when he reached the edge of the firefight stopped him cold. Boone had run directly to Sheriff Morrison, positioning himself between her and the hostile gunfire, and Morrison was speaking to the dog with the familiarity of a longtime partner. "Good boy," she said, reloading her weapon while Boone provided early warning of approaching threats. Just like old times, the pieces of an impossible puzzle began clicking into place in Eli's mind. Boone's unusual intelligence, his ability to find the buried money, his instant recognition of Morrison, none of it was coincidence. Morrison keyed her radio again, this time speaking in what Eli recognized as federal law enforcement codes. "This is Agent Morrison, FBI. Subjects are armed and dangerous. Authorization to use deadly force is granted. FBI." Morrison wasn't a small-town sheriff. She was a federal agent who had been working undercover for years, watching Marcus and waiting. For exactly this moment, a new voice cut through the chaos of gunfire, older and more authoritative than Tommy Carver's shouts. "Enough!" The shooting stopped abruptly. "Morrison, I know you can hear me. Let's discuss this like civilized people." Vincent Carver stepped into view. A man in his 60s with silver hair and expensive clothing that looked absurdly formal in the mountain setting. Even at a distance, his presence commanded attention and respect from his subordinates. "There's nothing to discuss, Carver." Morrison called back. "You're under arrest for murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. Your nephew and his friends can surrender now and live, or they can join you in federal prison." Carver's laugh carried genuine amusement. "You've been watching that cabin for 3 years, Morrison. 3 years waiting for me to make exactly this mistake. But you still don't understand what's really happening here." He gestured toward the forest where Eli remained hidden. "Marcus Thorne was never part of my organization. He was working for you people from the beginning, wasn't he? The robbery, the hiding, all of it was federal theater designed to flush out the real targets." Eli's world tilted on its axis. Marcus, an FBI informant? It would explain so much. The guilt, the isolation, the careful documentation of everything related to the robbery. But it would also mean his brother had been living a lie even deeper than Eli had imagined. "Marcus Thorne is dead," Morrison replied. "Whatever arrangement you think existed died with him. But his brother isn't dead," Carver said, and Eli felt ice form in his stomach. Eli Thorne, former Army Ranger, 20-year veteran with specialized training in asymmetric warfare. The perfect person to continue his brother's work, wouldn't you say? Through the rifle scope, Eli watched Carver pull out a cell phone and display something on its screen to Morrison. Even at a distance, he could see her body language change. Surprise, then anger, then what looked like resignation. "Show yourself." "Mr. Thorne," Carver called toward Eli's position. "Let's clear up this misunderstanding before anyone else gets hurt." Eli hesitated, but Boone's distress was becoming obvious even from his hiding place. The old dog was struggling to breathe, and the stress of the confrontation was pushing his damaged heart beyond its limits. Against every tactical instinct he possessed, Eli emerged from the tree line with his rifle lowered but ready. As he approached the standoff, Morrison's expression confirmed his worst fears. "He's got photos," she said quietly when he was close enough to hear. "Pictures of you at the cabin, with the strongbox. Carver's been watching for weeks. The federal agent's next." Words hit him like a physical blow. "Your brother was working undercover for the Bureau, Eli. The robbery was a sting operation that went wrong when Carver decided to eliminate witnesses. Marcus spent 25 years in deep cover, maintaining his identity as a criminal while feeding us intelligence on Carver's organization." She paused, checking her weapon while keeping watch on Carver's position. "The money you found was evidence, marked bills and tracked securities that we've been using to monitor Carver's attempts to recover his assets. Every time he sent people looking for it, we learned more about his network." Eli stared at her in disbelief. "You've been using me as bait." Not intentionally. We expected Carver to try recovering the money eventually, but we thought we had more. A time to brief you on the situation. Morrison's expression was grim. Marcus's death accelerated everything. Carver knew this was his last chance to eliminate the evidence and the witnesses. Boone collapsed beside Morrison, his breathing shallow and rapid. The stress and exertion had finally overwhelmed his failing heart, and Eli could see the dog was dying. The second strongbox, Morrison continued, pulling a small metal container from her jacket. Marcus left this for you specifically. He knew you might end up in exactly this situation. Inside the box, Eli found Marcus's FBI credentials, his real mission parameters, and a letter explaining everything his brother had been forbidden to tell him while alive. The final paragraph made his hands shake. If you're reading this, then Carver has finally made his move, and Agent Morrison has revealed her true identity. The choice you make next will determine whether two good men died for nothing, or whether their sacrifice finally brings justice to the families they left behind. Boone will show you the way. He always has. The revelation that Marcus had been an undercover federal agent reframed everything Eli thought he understood about his brothers, life and death. But as Boone lay gasping at Morrison's feet, his breathing growing more labored with each passing moment, the larger implications of federal conspiracies and long-term investigations seemed less important than the immediate choice between surrender and resistance. Your brother left you more than just explanations, Morrison said, keeping her weapon trained on Carver's position while speaking quietly to Eli. Check the bottom of that box. Beneath Marcus's FBI credentials, Eli found a small digital device that looked like a GPS unit, but displayed tactical information instead of roads and landmarks. The screen showed positions of friendly and hostile forces in real time, along with what appeared to be pre-planned coordination points and backup arrival times. Marcus spent 3 years preparing for this moment, Morrison explained. He knew Carver would eventually come for the money, and he knew you might be the one standing between him and those evidence files when it happened. The device showed that FBI tactical units were indeed surrounding the area, but they were holding positions rather than moving in for immediate capture. Someone, presumably Morrison, was controlling the pace of this confrontation, allowing it to develop according to a predetermined plan. You're still using me as bait, Eli said, his anger building despite the tactical situation. Even now, even with Boone dying and Carver's men ready to kill anyone who gets in their way. Morrison's expression showed genuine regret, but her voice remained steady and professional. Marcus volunteered for this assignment, Eli. After the robbery went wrong and those guards died, he spent 25 years trying to make it right. This is his last chance to complete the mission. Carver's voice carried through the forest again, closer now as he maneuvered for better position. I'm growing impatient, Morrison. Let's resolve this situation before my associates become creative in their problem-solving methods. The threat was clear. Tommy Carver and the other gunmen were positioned to cause significant casualties if the standoff continued much longer. These weren't patient negotiators. They were violent criminals who had already killed 2 guards and would have no hesitation about adding more bodies to their count. But Eli was no longer the broken, directionless man who had arrived at the cabin a week ago. The discovery of Marcus's true identity, the revelation of his brother's courage and sacrifice, had awakened something in him that had been dormant since Sarah's death, a sense of purpose that transcended his own survival. Boone struggled to lift his head, his eyes finding Eli's face with an intensity that seemed to communicate something beyond the capacity of human language. The dog's breathing was failing, but his expression held the same determined intelligence that had led him to dig up the strongbox, the same loyalty that had brought him racing into gunfire to protect Morrison. In the old retriever's eyes, Eli saw 25 years of Marcus's dedication to justice, his commitment to making amends for a single terrible day that had cost 2 innocent men their lives. Boone had been more than a companion. He had been Marcus's partner in an undercover mission that required absolute secrecy and perfect loyalty. "The cabin," Eli said suddenly, understanding flooding through him as he studied the tactical display. Marcus fortified it for exactly this situation. The defensive positions, the escape routes, the supply caches, it's all designed to channel attackers into predetermined kill zones. Morrison nodded grimly. "Your brother was a brilliant tactical planner. He spent 3 years turning that property into a fortress designed to contain and capture Carver's people when they finally came for the evidence." The tactical device showed additional information now that Eli understood how to read it. Hidden. Cameras throughout the forest were feeding real-time intelligence to federal forces, and the supply caches Marcus had established contained more than just weapons and ammunition. They held surveillance equipment and communication gear that would allow coordinated response with backup units. But the plan required someone with military experience to execute it properly, someone who understood small unit tactics and asymmetric warfare. Marcus had been counting on Eli to fill that role if circumstances required it. "He planned this entire confrontation," Eli said, the scope of his brother's sacrifice becoming clear. "The inheritance, the dog, even my discovery of the money, it was all designed to bring me here at the right moment." Marcus knew he was dying, Morrison confirmed. The heart condition that killed him was diagnosed months ago. He used his remaining time to prepare for the possibility that you might have to finish what he started. Carver's patience was clearly exhausted. Gunfire erupted again, this time more sustained and directed, as his men tried to advance on Morrison's position. She returned fire with professional competence, but she was outnumbered and would eventually be overwhelmed without support. Eli made his decision with the cold clarity that had kept him alive through multiple combat deployments. He wasn't running anymore, wasn't drifting through life, waiting for death to claim him like it had claimed Sarah. He was exactly where Marcus had needed him to be, with exactly the skills required to complete a mission that had consumed his brother's life. "Boone," he said quietly, kneeling beside the dying dog, "you showed me what Marcus needed me to see. Now it's time to finish this." The retriever's tail moved once against the forest floor, a final gesture of acknowledgement and trust. Then his breathing stopped, and the intelligence faded from his eyes, leaving behind only the peaceful expression of a soldier who had completed his final mission. Eli stood, checking his rifle and confirming the positions of hostile forces on the tactical display. The cabin's defensive systems were still intact, and Marcus's careful preparation had created multiple opportunities for tactical advantage. But executing the plan would require moving through hostile territory while under fire, and there was no guarantee that federal backup would arrive in time to prevent casualties. "I need 10 minutes, he told Morrison, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had made similar decisions under fire before. "Can you keep them occupied that long?" She nodded, reloading her weapon with practiced efficiency. "Marcus said you'd know what to do when the time came. He was right about that, just like he was right about everything else." As Eli prepared to move through the forest toward the cabin, he felt the weight of his brother's sacrifice and the memory of 2 murdered guards whose families still deserved justice. This wasn't about money or revenge or even survival. It was about completing a mission that had defined Marcus's life and giving meaning to deaths that had haunted him for 25 years. Behind him, Morrison's steady return fire provided cover as he began working his way through the trees, following routes Marcus had mapped and memorized for exactly this moment. The tactical display showed hostile positions updating in real time, and Eli could see the pattern of Carver's assault beginning to develop. They were walking into a trap that had been 25 years in the making, orchestrated by a dead man. who had never stopped being a soldier, never stopped fighting for justice, never stopped believing that the right choice was worth any sacrifice. Ahead, the cabin waited in its clearing, surrounded by defensive positions and tactical advantages that Marcus had spent 3 years perfecting. The final battle of a long war was about to begin, and Eli Thorne was no longer running from his past. He was racing toward it with the determination of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. Eli reached the cabin's perimeter as Carver's coordinated assault began in earnest. The property Marcus had spent 3 years fortifying was about to face its ultimate test, with Eli as its lone defender against 6 armed professionals who had no intention of leaving witnesses. The first advantage became apparent immediately. Marcus had cleared specific sight lines while leaving others deliberately obstructed, creating natural choke points where attackers would be forced to expose themselves while Eli remained concealed. The fallen logs and rock formations that looked like random forest debris were actually carefully positioned fighting positions with overlapping fields of fire. Through his rifle scope, Eli could see Tommy Carver leading the assault from the east, his inexperience showing in the way he moved too quickly between cover positions. Behind him came 2 older operators who understood the terrain better but were constrained by their need to keep the young man alive. Vincent Carver's nephew was both an asset and a liability in combat. The tactical display showed Morrison maintaining her position in the forest, keeping the remaining 3 gunmen pinned down with accurate fire while they tried to flank her. But her ammunition wouldn't last forever, and she was gradually being forced back toward terrain that offered less cover. Eli's first shot took out the lead scout attempting to approach the cabin from the north, a clean hit that dropped the man instantly and announced to the remaining attackers that their quarry was no longer running. The suppressed rifle made less noise than they would expect, and the shot's origin was difficult to pinpoint from their positions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Automatic weapons fire raked the cabin's exterior, shattering windows and splintering wood, but Marcus's defensive preparations held. The building's thick log construction had been reinforced with steel plates in critical areas, and the angles of attack had been calculated to minimize effective cover for approaching hostiles. But Eli could see the tactical problem developing. Carver's men were spreading out to encircle the cabin, and their superior numbers would eventually allow them to coordinate simultaneous assaults from multiple directions. His defensive advantages were significant but temporary. Eventually, they would find weak points in his perimeter. The solution lay in Marcus's most ingenious preparation, a series of improvised explosive devices hidden throughout the property. Not massive demolitions that would level the forest, but small, precisely placed charges designed to channel enemy movement into predetermined zones where Eli could engage them effectively. The detonators were simple, motion sensors connected to small amounts of explosive that would create confusion and temporary disorientation rather than massive casualties. Marcus had been planning to capture Carver's people alive if possible, maintaining his cover as a federal agent even in the final confrontation. Eli triggered the first set of charges as Tommy Carver's team attempted to rush the cabin's rear entrance. The explosions weren't large enough to cause serious injury, but they were loud enough to disorient the attackers and bright enough to temporarily blind anyone looking directly at them. In the confusion that followed, Eli managed to disable another gunman with a precisely placed shot to the shoulder that would keep him down without killing him. But Vincent Carver himself remained hidden, directing his subordinates' assault while staying out of direct combat. Through his scope, Eli caught glimpses of the older man moving between positions, coordinating attacks with the experience of someone who had survived decades in criminal leadership by never taking unnecessary risks. Tactical display showed federal backup units finally beginning to move, but they were still several minutes away. Morrison's position was becoming untenable as her remaining opponents pressed their attack, and Eli could hear the increasing desperation in her return fire. A new sound cut through the chaos. Helicopter rotors, but not the law enforcement aircraft that had been circling earlier. This was something larger, with the deep thrumming of a heavy transport helicopter. Through his scope, Eli could see ropes dropping from the aircraft as additional personnel prepared to fast rope into the combat zone. Carver's reinforcements had arrived, turning what had been a manageable tactical situation into something that threatened to overwhelm even Marcus's careful preparations. The old criminal's resources ran deeper than anyone had anticipated, and his willingness to escalate the confrontation suggested he viewed this as a final, decisive battle rather than a simple recovery operation. Eli's ammunition was running low, and the cabin's defensive positions were being systematically compromised as Carver's expanded force probed for weaknesses. The improvised explosives had bought him time, but they couldn't replace the fundamental disadvantage of being outnumbered by trained professionals. It was then that he remembered Marcus's final preparation, the service weapon hidden behind the false wall in the cabin's main room. His brother had left more than just a rifle for this moment. He had left the tools and weapons of a career soldier who understood that sometimes overwhelming force required an overwhelming response. The weapon was an M4 carbine, military specification with full automatic capability, along with sufficient ammunition to sustain prolonged engagement. But more importantly, attached to the weapon's carry case was a final message from Marcus. If you're reading this, then everything has gone according to plan, and Vincent Carver has finally made the mistake that will end his criminal career. The charges I've placed throughout the property can be triggered remotely using the device, in this case. Use them wisely. They contain enough explosive power to level the entire clearing, but they're also the only way to ensure Carver doesn't escape to hurt more innocent people. Eli stared at the remote detonator, understanding the choice his brother had prepared for him. Marcus had wired the entire property with enough explosives to ensure that no one, including Eli himself, would leave Bitter Hollow alive. It was a scorched earth solution that would eliminate Carver's threat permanently, but at the cost of everything Marcus had built and everyone currently in the combat zone. Outside, the sound of coordinated assault teams moving into final positions told him that his time for decision was running out. Carver's reinforcements were professional military contractors, not the street criminals Eli had been engaging. They would overwhelm his defenses within minutes unless he took drastic action. The remote detonator felt heavy in his hands, loaded with the weight of a choice that would define everything that followed. The final assault began with coordinated precision that spoke to Carver's military contractor's professional training. Flashbang grenades shattered what remained of the cabin's windows, and smoke canisters created a grey fog that obscured sight. Lines and made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Eli moved through the cabin like a ghost, using Marcus's prepared fighting positions and his own combat experience to stay ahead of the advancing assault teams. The M4 carbine's automatic fire capability allowed him to lay down suppressing fire that kept the attackers honest, but his ammunition was finite, and their numbers seemed endless. Through the tactical display, he could see Morrison's position being overrun. The federal agent was making her final stand behind a fallen tree, but 3 of Carver's men were closing in from multiple angles. In minutes, she would be dead or captured, and with her would die the last chance of bringing Carver to justice through legal means. That was when Vincent Carver himself stepped into view. The old criminal walked across the clearing with the confidence of a man who knew the battle was won, flanked by 2 heavily armed bodyguards who swept the area for threats while keeping their principal protected. Carver was speaking into a radio, coordinating the final phases of his assault, and his voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had waited years for this moment. "Eli Thorne," he called toward the cabin, his words cutting through the chaos of gunfire and explosions. "Your brother cost me 25 years of my life. I think it's time you paid that debt." The remote detonator lay beside Eli's position, its red activation button seeming to pulse in the dim light. Marcus's final solution was still available. One press of that button would end everything permanently, ensuring that Carver's criminal organization died with him in the Montana wilderness. But as Eli watched through his rifle scope, he saw something that changed everything. Morrison wasn't dead. The federal agent was wounded and pinned down, but she was still fighting, still trying to complete the mission that had consumed Marcus's life. More importantly, the tactical display showed federal backup units finally breaching the outer perimeter, moving through the forest with the coordination and firepower needed to tip the balance. Carver had made a fatal mistake. In his eagerness to end the 25-year hunt personally, he had exposed himself in the center of the clearing, trusting his numerical advantage to protect him from a single defender with limited ammunition. He had forgotten that Eli Thorne was no ordinary defender. The shot that took down Vincent Carver was the kind of precision marksmanship that separated professional soldiers from weekend hunters. Eli's bullet found its target at 200 yards through shifting smoke and debris, dropping the criminal mastermind where he stood and sending his bodyguards diving for cover that no longer existed. But it was what happened next that reminded Eli why his brother had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. Tommy Carver, seeing his uncle fall, abandoned all tactical discipline and charged the cabin in a rage-driven assault that brought him directly into the crosshairs of every federal agent now converging on the clearing. The young man's death was as inevitable as it was unnecessary, the final casualty of a criminal enterprise that had already claimed too many innocent lives. The remaining contractors, finding themselves surrounded by federal forces and deprived of leadership, chose surrender over a futile last stand. The battle for Bitter Hollow was over, ended not by Marcus's explosive solution, but by the coordination and courage of law enforcement officers who had spent years preparing for this moment. As smoke cleared from the battlefield, Eli found Morrison beside the cabin, wounded but alive, cradling something in her arms that made his breath catch in his throat. Boone, impossibly, was still breathing, weak and fading, but alive. "Dogs are tougher than we give them credit for," Morrison said through gritted teeth. "Her own injury is obvious, but not life-threatening. He's been Marcus's partner for 3 years of undercover work. I think he wanted to see this through to the end." Federal medics arrived as part of the backup units, immediately beginning treatment for both Morrison and the dog, while crime scene specialists began documenting evidence that would ensure convictions for every surviving member of Carver's organization. In the aftermath of violence, as helicopters landed in the clearing and federal agents began processing the scene, Eli found himself holding the remote detonator that Marcus had prepared as a final option. His brother had been willing to sacrifice everything to ensure justice for Daniel Reeves and Robert Chen, but he had also trusted Eli to find a better way. The families of the murdered guards would finally have their answers. The money that had haunted Marcus for 25 years would be returned to its rightful owners, and Vincent Carver's criminal organization would face the full weight of federal prosecution for crimes that had gone unpunished for far too long. Justice, Eli realized, didn't always require the ultimate sacrifice. Sometimes it just required the courage to stand up when standing up mattered most. 6 months after the battle at Bitter Hollow, Eli stood in a federal courthouse in Denver, watching as the last members of Vincent Carver's organization received their sentences. The trials had been swift and decisive, with overwhelming evidence ensuring that justice was finally served for crimes that had festered in darkness for 25 years. Agent Kate Morrison, her arm still in a sling from wounds sustained during the firefight, stood beside him as the judge read the final verdict. Life sentences without parole for the surviving contractors, federal seizure of assets worth millions of dollars, and most importantly, closure for the families of Daniel Reeves and Robert Chen. The money from the strongbox had been returned to the victims' families, along with accumulated interest and compensation from the federal government. It wouldn't bring back their fathers and husbands, but it provided security and acknowledgement that their losses hadn't been forgotten. Marcus would be proud, Morrison said quietly as they left the courthouse together. 25 years of undercover work, and it all came together exactly the way he planned. Eli nodded, though his thoughts were focused on the future rather than the past. The cabin at Bitter Hollow had been repaired and restored, its battle damage erased by careful craftsmanship and attention to detail. He'd decided to make it his permanent home, honoring his brother's memory by maintaining the place Marcus had loved despite the terrible secrets it had harbored. Boone had survived his heart episode, though the veterinarians warned that his condition remained serious. The old retriever now spent his days sleeping in patches of sunlight on the cabin's front porch, occasionally rousing himself to inspect visitors or investigate interesting smells in the forest. The dog's intelligence remained sharp, but his body was finally accepting the limitations of age and illness. The collar around Boone's neck was new, bright red leather with a brass nameplate that read Boone Thorne, Hero Dog. Eli had commissioned it from a craftsman in Millfield, wanting to honor the animal's service to both Marcus and the federal investigation that had consumed so much of their lives. "Have you given any thought to Morrison's offer?" Kate asked, as they walked through Denver's downtown streets toward the parking garage where Eli's truck waited. The FBI had offered him a position as a consultant, drawing on his military experience and newfound knowledge of criminal organizations to assist in other long-term investigations. It was interesting work that would provide purpose and income, but it would also mean leaving Bitter Hollow for extended periods. "I'm still considering it," Eli replied truthfully. "But right now, I think Boone and I both need some quiet time to figure out what comes next." What came next, he hoped, might include more of Agent Morrison's company. Their shared experience during the confrontation with Carver had created a bond that extended beyond professional cooperation, and her visits to the cabin had become increasingly frequent and personal over the past few months. The drive back to Montana took them through country that was becoming familiar rather than foreign to Eli. The mountains no longer seemed isolating. They felt protective, embracing. The winding roads that had once led him toward unwanted responsibility now guided him home to a place where he belonged. At the cabin, Boone greeted them with the enthusiasm his aging body could muster, tail wagging slowly as he accepted attention from both humans. The dog's medication regime had stabilized his condition, and while he would never again be the vigorous animal who had raced through gunfire to protect his human partners, he was comfortable and content. That evening, as Kate helped Eli prepare dinner in Marcus's restored kitchen, she asked the question he'd been expecting for weeks. "What are you going to do with the rest of your life, Eli Thorne?" He looked around the cabin that had become his home, at the dog who had shown him the way to redemption, at the woman who had brought both danger and purpose back into his world. For the first time since Sarah's death, the future held possibilities that excited rather than terrified him. "I'm going to live it," he said simply. "Every day, every moment, in a way that honors the people who didn't get that chance." Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in colors that reminded Eli of hope rather than loss. Boone dozed by the fireplace, occasionally twitching in dreams that might have been memories of younger days, when his legs were strong and his heart was steady. The walking stick Marcus had carved still leaned against the cabin's wall, its intricate designs now telling a story Eli understood completely. It spoke of patience and craftsmanship, of time spent in quiet contemplation while wrestling with demons that could only be defeated through persistent, careful work. Tomorrow, Eli would begin carving his own walking stick, using tools Marcus had left behind and wood from trees that had watched over Bitter Hollow for generations. It would be different from his brother's creation, reflecting his own journey and the lessons he'd learned about courage, sacrifice, and the possibility of redemption. But tonight, he was content to sit by the fire with Kate beside him and Boone. At their feet, listening to the wind in the pines and feeling grateful for the chance to build something meaningful from the wreckage of the past. Some folks say a man can lose everything and still find his way back. Eli Thorne had learned that sometimes the journey home requires traveling through darkness and danger, guided by the loyalty of an old dog and the memory of a brother who never stopped believing in justice. Sometimes that journey leads exactly where it's supposed to,